In this video, I'm going over the concept now that we start discussing, which is our complex numbers. So before we just talked about the imaginary number, right, where I is equal to square root of -1. So now when adding a real number to that, you have a real part and imaginary part. We have now what is called the complex number. So notice the real part is just like our good old, like a 2. Then we add to that, or we could subtract from it, right? An imaginary part. So like 3i here. So like, for example, here are some complex numbers. So like -2, that's your real part, and the imaginary part is the positive 6i. Notice here, the real part is +4 with an imaginary part of -i, right? Or -1i. So these are all complex numbers. Now, technically, you could also have a complex number where it's just like 4i, because what is the real number that's being added to our imaginary? Well, if nothing is here, then what represents nothing? 0. So that could be written as 0 plus 4i. So keep that in mind as well. We're going to also talk about today how every complex number has what is called a conjugate. So like, for example, a plus bi, so like 2 plus 3i, has a conjugate of a minus bi, or in this case, 2 minus 3i. So notice, what did we change the sign of to get the conjugate? Well, we keep the real part, so we change the sign of the imaginary part. So again, keeping in mind, and this is our standard form where the real is first, the conjugate is second, and we only change the imaginary part. And for the conjugate, we change the sign of the imaginary part. So if I wanted to write here the conjugate of -3 plus 2i, then this is keep the -3, but now plus 2i is now minus 2i. That is the conjugate. So again, here, identify the imaginary part, right? See how we're in standard form? So here is my imaginary part. So that's what I'm going to change the sign of. So keep the 5, but bring down, and plus 12i is the conjugate. Now notice here, is this in standard form? No. So see how the imaginary part is first? So let's switch it. Now notice this is a -1. So -1 and positive 7i. So keep the sign. So now let's identify. Here's the imaginary part, positive 7i. So keep the -1, but minus 7i. Go ahead and pause the video and try these two on your own, writing the conjugate. And here we go. So for the first one, you should have identified that the imaginary part is -2i, so -5 plus 2i is the conjugate. Then you should have noticed here, not in standard form, so 4 plus 6i is now in standard form. Then change the sign of the imaginary part, so 4 minus 6i is your conjugate. So now also simplifying, going back now, but now we're going to focus on complex numbers. So like here, for example, I've got 2 plus, then here we go. We talked about this in a previous, the square root of -9. Well, the square root of 9 is 3. And remember, the square root of -1 is I. That's the imaginary. Therefore, the square root of -9 is 3i. Then we'll also practice continuing, just like what we did with the conjugate, identifying the real and the imaginary. So our real is 2, and the imaginary is positive 3i. So then here, I've got 5 minus, now notice we do need to break this apart. So again, here we've got 75 and -1. So we know we're going to need I, our imaginary. So now breaking this apart, we can break it apart into, well, what two factors? 25 and 3, right? So 25 and 3, because what is the square root of 25? 5. So 5i, then keep radical 3. So 5 minus 5i, radical 3. So again, here, the real part is 5. The imaginary is the entire negative 5i radical 3. So then notice here, the square root of negative 16. Well, again, the square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So 4i minus 6. However, let's make sure to write this in standard form. So negative 6, right? Keep the sign with our part, then plus 4i. So here, notice the real is negative 6 with the imaginary part of positive 4i. Now notice here, the negative is on the outside. So we have negative, right? Because that's a negative 1. Now that's just the square root of 16, not a negative 16, right? That's just square root of 16, which is 4. So negative square root of 16 is negative 4. Then plus the square root of a negative 49. So now square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So negative 4 plus 7i. Here, your real part is negative 4 with an imaginary part of positive 7i. So notice the difference. This was a negative, but notice how we are taking the square root of a positive 16. So that's why it's not imaginary. But here you're taking the square root of a negative 49, which is like 49 times negative 1. That's why here you have an imaginary number. Go ahead and pause the video and try the 2 U-tries on your own. But for this, you're getting not only the complex number like what we did, but now write the conjugate. So again, identify the imaginary part and change the sign of the imaginary part to get the conjugate. And here we go. So for your complex number, you should have seen here, you're taking the square root of 8, negative 64. So this is imaginary. So not just 8, right, but 8i minus 3. So your complex number in standard form is negative 3, right? Keep the sign with it, plus 8i. So you're changing the sign of only the imaginary part for the conjugate, which is negative 3 minus 8i. So then here you have negative 1 because it's outside. So negative, now that's the square root of a positive 25. So that's just negative 5, not imaginary. Minus. Now notice you are taking the square root of a negative 36. So this is imaginary. 6i. So you do have this already in standard form. Then change the sign, but only the imaginary for the conjugate. So negative 5 plus 6i is your conjugate. And so last is now the graphing. Now remember before, right? When graphing, we only graphed on, if you think about it like the imaginary, right? So again, we're still sticking with how the x-axis is the real and the y is the imaginary because we're going above and below, right? We're not plotting on our real number. So like here, notice this example was plotted for you. This is the complex number of 2 plus I, because we are now actually plotting a real part, so we're locating the real at 2, and positive I, or plus 1i, so 2 plus I. So like what is point A? Well, what is the real part? Well, the real A is here at negative 4. So negative 4. Then we go up, right? So plus how many imaginary? 1, 2, 3. So negative 4 plus 3i. So if we wanted to plot negative 2 minus I. So again here, negative 2. So here's negative 2. But then minus I, or negative 1i. So we need to go below 1 unit. So that is point B. So then here, point C, negative 6. So here's that real part, negative 6 plus 3i. So we're going to go above 3 units. That is point C. Now point D, we do need to simplify. So this is just the square root of 25. That's just 5. Then plus the square root of negative 16. Now is this imaginary? Yes, because this is square root of a negative value, -1. So this is not just 4, but 4i. So positive 5, and then we're going to go above from 5, we're going to go up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That is point D. So then E is 1 minus, again, square root of a -9, so not just 3, but 3i. So we're going to start at positive 1, right? So here's your 1. Then from there, we need to go -3i, so down 3. 1, 2, 3. That is point E. So then last, point F. So this is, now notice the negative is on the outside. So we do have a negative because that's -1. And we are taking the square root of a negative value. So square root of -36, which is 6i. So now this is just like what we did with plotting the imaginary. There's 0, so we just go up or down. Down 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that is point F, plotting our imaginary unit here, which technically is the complex number 0 minus 6i. So go ahead and pause the video and plot these 4 points on your own. So again, remember, right, this is always your real number, right? It's like the number line. And your y is your imaginary. So plot these 4 points on your own and then identify what complex numbers represent point N and P, and we'll see how you do. And here we go. So point J, you should have plotted, so 6 plus 5i. So 6 and up positive 5 is point J. Point K, -2 plus 3i. So negative here, -2, so -2, but again, plus 3i. So above 3, that is point K. Point L is just the square root of -4, which is 2i. So you only had to go from 0 up to imaginary units for point L. Point M, you should have simplified. This is -3 because you're taking the square root of +9, so it's not an imaginary, but plus the square root of -25, which is imaginary, 5i. So -3, then above 5 units. So 5i is point M. So point N. Well, here you're at the real part of 3, but then you go down to -2. So -2i. Point P, we're over here now on the left above -4. So -4, and because we go above 1 unit above it, so plus 1i or plus I.